The manhunt continues for a mountain man wanted for murder. Please be advised that the suspect is armed and dangerous.
FBI! Get your hands up!
Shots fired! Get a squad down here.
Officer down! Officer down!
7415, any responding south cars, we have shots fired. Utilize caution.
My name is George Barrett, and I was born in Clay County, Kentucky, along a stretch of water that folks called Cane Creek, just 20 years after the war between the states finally ended. Like most men, my father came home from that war with nothing left but bitterness. Whatever he'd had before the fighting, land, hope, pride, well, it was all gone. All that remained was a deep hatred for anyone who'd stood with the other side. That's him right there in this picture, along with my mama on their wedding day. Look at my father's eyes. His face tells a story of a man who was no stranger to desperate times and a hard life. And there's my mama, just 14 years old and probably scared to death, in a dress that she had to borrow just to pose for this picture. She would eventually give birth to 11 of us youngins. And me, well, I was one of the youngest. We were raised more like work mules than children. From the time we could walk, we were all expected to work. And no matter how hard I tried, my parents never missed a chance to tell me how no count I was. My pa had no patience for a boy who couldn't handle a plow or drive a team of mules the way he thought a man should. And my mama, well, I just remember how sad her eyes always were. And looking back, she probably never had a moment's peace. And well, I truly believe she just resented having a house full of children to always look after. And as you might imagine, being surrounded by such loving parents, I did all I could to spend as much time away from that house as possible. But it seemed all I ever found was trouble. At school, I was always getting into fights. Well, I remember when I was 10 years old, and I was walking home when a group of teenagers started bullying me. I was outnumbered 3-1, so I picked up a rock, and I hit that other boy so hard in the head that he didn't wake up till 4 days later after they had to send for a city doc to save him. And before long, I was running with those Baker boys. They had been feuding for years with the Whites and the Howard clans in one of Kentucky's most famous feuds. And I fit right in. And one night, several of us were gambling over a card game when a gang of those Whites ambushed us and a brawl broke out. When the rocks and fists started flying, I broke and ran to try to get away. But 2 of those white boys took out after me and chased me towards the creek when they finally caught up to me. And a moment later, I was on the ground on the wrong end of a kicking to the head. Over and over, they bashed me with their boots. I had no choice, so I pulled my pocket knife and I stabbed one boy in the leg and the other in the stomach, leaving them bleeding right there at that creek while I ran home. By daybreak, several men from the Howard and the White families showed up at our cabin with torches, and they told my pa, plain and simple, that if he didn't pack up and leave the county, well, they would just burn our home to the ground. And having no choice, my ma and pa took all our belongings, and a few days later, we arrived at our new home in Jackson County, Kentucky, in a place called Clover Bottom. So you see, I learned early on that no one in this world was ever going to look out for me, and I would have to fight for everything. And that's exactly what I did. And no sooner than we got settled in Clover Bottom, I once again got caught up running with the wrong crowd. Only this time, it wasn't cards or fists. It was making moonshine. That's right. By the time I was 15, I was proficient in the art of working the old copper kettle. And before long, I held the first $5 bill I had ever seen in my life from selling blockade liquor. And that money was burning a hole in my pocket. So I walked 12 miles to Barrett, Kentucky, where I bought my first pair of boots. They cost me $2. And then I went across the street to the gun shop, and I knew exactly what I wanted. An Ivor Johnson .32 caliber nickel-plated pocket revolver with a 4-inch barrel and an owl's head on the grip. It cost me exactly $2. Then I bought 100 cartridges for 30 cents. The time had come. I was now a man. For the next few years, I became known as a tough guy. And for the first time, it seemed like people respected me. But as good as things were, deep down I longed for adventure. After all, it was the turning of the century, and it was a big world. Yet here I was trapped in an endless sea of mountains. I didn't want to spend my entire life here. I wanted to travel and see with my own eyes places that I'd only read about in books. And one day, when I was in Manchester, Kentucky, I stepped into a military recruiting office. And once they learned that I could shoot and wasn't afraid of violence, the government man told me that if I volunteered for the Army, I would travel while wearing the most respected uniform in the world and even get paid for it. Now that was music to my ears. So, in 1904, I became a soldier in the United States Army. I caught a train north, and a couple of days later, I arrived at Fort Thomas, Kentucky. Days before Fort Thomas started before daylight, a bugle would rip through the barracks, and within minutes, we were on our feet, boots laced, and beds tight enough to bounce a coin. If a man was slow or sloppy, well, he paid for it with extra duty, extra drills, or the sharp tongue of a sergeant who took pleasure in breaking a man down. And then there was the marching, the endless marching, until your feet were numb and your legs felt like iron rods. Most of those city boys, well, they couldn't handle it. But me, heck, I'd been climbing hills barefooted all my life, so walking on a flat ground in brand new socks and government-issued boots, well, that was easy. And then they handed me a rifle. Now, they seemed proud of the quality of the weapon. All those city boys beamed with pride. Most of them, they had never held a gun in their life before. Well, me, my first thought was how greasy it was. I knew how to keep a rifle as clean as a newborn baby, because back home, our lives depended on these guns. The first thing I did was take that thing and break it into a million parts and clean it squeaky clean. The looks on the drill sergeants' faces seemed like they had never seen someone clean a gun like that before. And one of them even asked me how I'd learned to do it. And I replied, "Sir, we make our own rifles back home, sir." Now, most of those new recruits couldn't hit nothing with those guns. Not only would they miss the entire target, but they would miss the entire hill that the target was mounted on. Me, I'd been shooting squirrels since I was 5 and killing turkeys at 100 yards by the time I was 11. Simply put, I loved the Army life. And in 1908, I even wrote a letter to the newspaper back home. "Well, boys, why don't you come out and be a soldier for Uncle Sam? The pay is increased and the duty is easy. This is my second enlistment. And if I was discharged today, I would enlist again." I left Columbus, Ohio on August 28th and reached Fort Douglas on September 2nd. I came through the Rocky Mountains. It's a fine scenery. I saw lots of snow and ice in the hills and saw one mountain lion and 2 black bears. I came by Pikes Peak, Colorado, which is 16,000 feet above sea level, and I saw several Indian camps and lots of pretty Western girls. Oh, I think the West is a fine climate for health and beauty. I'm well satisfied here. The entire regiment will be here till September 1909, and then we'll go to Alaska. We have a fine band and lots of amusement. There's lots of nice fruit here in the valleys and lots of snow on the mountains. Boys, when my time is out, I'll come back to old Kentucky and I'll see you all, but then I'll join the Army again. Soldiering is the easiest life you can live. You only drill 30 minutes a day and do guard duty once a month. What's easier than that? You have a splendid chance to get an increase in your pay. I've become a sharpshooter, which is an extra $3 a month. My best wishes for you all. Yours truly, George W. Barrett. But alas, as good as the Army life was to me, by 1912, I was discharged and returned home to Kentucky. One thing I can say is even after traveling the world for 8 years, not a damn thing had changed in those mountains. And it only took me a few months to slip back to my old ways. By 1912, I'd made my way back to Kentucky and reacquainted myself with drinking and gambling. But unfortunately, that powerful combination always led to violence. One night, I was playing poker with my brother-in-law, and after a string of losing hands, well, he stood up and accused me of cheating. And then a second later, the card table was flipped, and we were locked in a brawl, all the way through the kitchen, and spilled out into the yard, where he pulled a .22 pistol and shot me in my left eye, instantly blinding me and causing me to wear a glass eye for the rest of my life. Even when I tried to get my mind right and walk the straight and narrow, it was impossible. There weren't any jobs to be found, and the only way a fella could seem to get his hands on any money was the manufacture of untaxed liquor. And that was an occupation that came as natural as breathing to me. So I set up a still and began pumping out stump water. But no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't seem to catch a break. Then, by 1913, federal revenuers had caught up with me. I was running a gallon of Mountain Dew when suddenly I heard the cock of a pistol behind me, and then an officer spoke. "George Barrett, I'm United States Deputy Marshal Nichols, and I've got a warrant for your arrest. You're coming with us." Now, most men would have simply put their hands in the air and surrendered. But believing there was only one officer, I pulled my pistol and I spun around. But before I could get a shot off, the lawman opened fire with a single shotgun blast of number 3 shot. The pellets hit me in the face, neck, chest, and right arm, and I nearly bled to death before they got me to jail. And there I would remain for the next several years. Now, by the time I would get out of jail, it was 1920 and America was changing. Up until now, most of the criminals that had been immortalized in newspapers and magazines were mob bosses and gangsters in places like Chicago and New York City. But the rise of the automobile was changing how crime was done in America. A new type of criminal was on the rise. Folks called them Hayseed killers. That's right. All over the South, gangs of young farm boys roared into America's cities with their high-powered cars, robbing and killing. They were highly mobile. They could commit a crime in one state and a few hours later be in another. And in many cases, state, county, and city law agencies had no established networks to track criminals. And because they had boundaries where their jurisdiction ended, they were overwhelmed. That's right. These new mountain criminals were a different breed and were a nightmare for law enforcement. Because of this, the United States government created a new federal agency that was authorized to operate in every state and county in the country. Thus, the FBI was born, but little did they know it, I was about to become a major problem for them in one of the largest crime rings in American history. Once I was finally a free man again, I moved to College Corner, a small town that straddled the border of Indiana and Ohio, where I worked as a streetcar conductor until I could scrape up enough money for a down payment on a new car. And from this single car, I launched into my master plan. Now, back then, vehicles didn't have VIN numbers. Instead, they had a serial number that was stamped on the engine with a set of dies at the factory. It was impossible for the public to get their hands on a set of those master die sets. But mountain folks, well, we've always had a way of getting around minor things like that. I took that car back home to Kentucky, where a friend of mine was a master in the art of counterfeiting. He used clay to create molds of that serial number on the engine, and from the clay mold, he created his own set of dies for that number. Next, I stole a car exactly like the one I had purchased, and we changed the serial numbers on the engine of the stolen car and sold it in another state to a car dealer, who then sold the stolen car to an unsuspecting customer. The plan was genius, and it was the easiest money I had ever made. In my very first year, I stole 19 luxury cars, changed the serial numbers, and sold them to car dealers in Ohio, Indiana, Texas, and even California. The next year, I stole 57 more, and the year after that, 72 more. With all the money I was making from stolen cars, I began the wholesale buying and selling of stolen guns and diamonds. I purchased 3 houses, one in St. Louis, Missouri, another in Cincinnati, Ohio, and one back home in Kentucky. Now, I've loved flashy cars, pretty women, and a wallet full of cash, and I always seem to have all 3 at the same time. Women? Oh, they love me. I kept a pocket full of diamonds, and soon I had married 5 women spread out all over America, and I kept several other girlfriends while fathering over a dozen children. That's right, I had a woman for every town I operated in, and I didn't go anywhere without a trunk full of guns, and folks knew that if you wanted a real diamond cheaper than wholesale, I was your man. By 1930, I was on top of the world and had established a nationwide stolen car network. It seemed like every other day I was driving a brand new Packard or Cadillac back to Kentucky to change its serial numbers. In September of that year, I had dropped my 6-year-old son off at my mother's house in Jackson County, Kentucky, while I processed a stolen Lincoln. But when I returned the next day to pick up my boy, on our way back out to the car, he told me that my mama had whipped him with an extension cord. I grabbed my pistol and stormed back into the house to confront her. I'd experienced those same beatings as a boy. She might have got away with it then, but this time she was gonna pay for it. No sooner than I entered the front door, I saw her standing in the kitchen, and I opened fire, shooting her in the stomach and then in the mouth, killing her dead. My sister was also in the house and started screaming and charged at me with an axe, so I shot her in the arm. But somehow, she managed to run out of the front door towards the road, where a mailman just happened to be passing in front of the house. She jumped onto the running boards of the car and told the mailman to floor it, but I still had 1 bullet left, which I fired and shot her right through the ear. Then I coolly got back in my car and headed north. I was now a fugitive, wanted for murder, and my brothers in the state of Kentucky posted a $700 reward for my arrest. But still, I managed to evade the law until the spring of 1931, and even then, they wouldn't have ever caught me. But I had secretly arranged to turn myself in to the prosecutor back in Kentucky, who just so happened to be none other than my first cousin. So now, I would have to face a jury of my peers. But the prosecution's case against me, well, it was weak, and I claimed self-defense. And because there were no witnesses, the trial ended in a hung jury. The judge scolded my cousin for his pathetic handling of the case, and even demanded a retrial. But the second time, I was acquitted and walked out of the courthouse a free man. But you see, by now, I had made many enemies in the stolen car business and had even caught the eye of Al Capone. And I knew something didn't feel right as soon as I walked out of that courthouse that morning with my defense attorney and my cousin, the prosecuting attorneys, by my side. No sooner than we got to the bottom of those courthouse steps, I got an eerie feeling. So I jumped underneath a parked car when gunshots rang out from a Tommy gun. The barrage lasted nearly 30 seconds, and when the bullets stopped flying, both attorneys were dead and the car I was hiding under was riddled with bullet holes. By 1931, George Barrett had transformed himself from a poor mountain boy to a true American gangster, running the largest stolen car crime ring in America, and dealing in stolen guns and diamonds. And by killing his sister and his own mother by shooting her in the mouth, it was clear that he was also a cold-blooded killer. Despite surviving an attempted mafia hit on his life outside the courthouse in Kentucky, law agencies across America were now looking for him, and so was the FBI. That's right, the law was hot on his trail, and by 1935, it all came to a spectacular conclusion that sent shockwaves across America.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 5 books for the young and old alike that will make your heart smile. Click the link below to order your copy of the Appalachian Storyteller today.
That's right. By 1935, George had been running from the law for 15 years, but time was running out. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had instructed the FBI to bring Barrett in dead or alive during a nationwide dragnet, where they finally pinned Barrett down in College Corner, Indiana. On the morning of August 16th, FBI agents Nelson Klein and Donald McGovern were on a stakeout outside of an apartment that Barrett was renting when George walked out of the apartment in broad daylight. The agents had been instructed to call for backup once Barrett was spotted, but the lawmen feared that the wanted man might escape, so they just ignored the orders and decided to confront him. Both FBI agents emerged from the car and ordered Barrett to stop, but George, well, he never turned around and just kept walking with a folded up newspaper in his right hand. And that's when Agent Klein decided to give chase. No sooner than he got within 100 feet of Barrett, the criminal took off running down the alley, trying to make it to his car. Agent Klein pulled his service weapon and demanded Barrett to stop. Yet Barrett, well, he reached into his newspaper and pulled out a .45 caliber pistol, and both men opened fire as Barrett dove behind a small tree. In the exchange, Barrett was shot in his left leg, where his kneecap was shattered, but Agent Klein was shot 5 times in his chest and arms. A moment later, Agent McGovern opened fire and shot Barrett in his right leg, when Barrett returned his final shot, but he missed. When the gun smoke finally cleared, FBI Agent Klein was dead and Barrett's running days were over. In fact, he was crippled and would never walk again. The gun battle had taken place on the Indiana-Ohio state line. Literally. You see, the FBI had fired from the Indiana side, and Barrett, where he was 22 feet on the Ohio side. And after weeks of determining just who had jurisdiction of the crime, the state of Indiana was finally chosen for the trial. And unfortunately for Barrett, just weeks before he killed Agent Klein, the federal government had passed a new law stating that anyone who killed an FBI agent would be subject to death by hanging. Since Indiana's official method for executions was the electric chair, they had no procedure. So they hired a 65-year-old farmer from Epworth, Illinois, who had just so happened to participate in 68 other hangings during his life as a hobby. And he was a man who prided himself in adjusting the noose just right, while his wife's hobby was stitching the hood that was placed over the condemned men's head. Now, you see, the old man had once been horrified by a poorly done hanging he had witnessed as a boy, so he decided to become an expert in the act of carrying out the deed. He built a gallows scaffold on his farm where he perfected the technique of exactly how to adjust the noose in the most effective and painless manner. For a while, he experimented with various types of rope, before one day he stumbled on the perfect kind, which just so happened to be the plow lines from his farm. Now, with his experience, it was no wonder that the state of Indiana promptly hired the farmer and rented his gallows to be installed on the jailhouse lawn just outside of Garrett's cell window. For days, the farmer oversaw the careful construction of the gallows, while Garrett listened to the hammering from inside of his cell. Once the old farmer was satisfied, The stage was set. They even erected a giant tent around the gallows and only admitted 1,000 ticketed members of the public who were lucky enough to witness the big event. And when you know it, 80% of those ticket holders were women who had come from all over America to see the handsome killer with their own eyes. 15 minutes before midnight, the jailer finally entered the condemned man's room and said it's time. Garrett sat up on his bed and took one last look out of his cell window at the giant tent, and he remarked, "Well, it looks like we're about to have a circus out there." Then he petted the jailhouse cat, handed his glass eye and spectacles to the jailer as he was placed in a wheelchair and wheeled out the last mile from cell number 1, all the way out to the death row tent, where all the women in the crowd panted and sniffled and shouted out how much they loved Barrett as 4 men carried the crippled dead man walking up the 13 steps leading to the gallows, where the crafty old farmer was patiently waiting with the same rope in his hand that he had used for 68 previous executions. Finally, after the wily farmer carefully adjusted the noose in the perfect spot and slipped his wife's hand-stitched hood over Barrett's head, he thoughtfully spit his tobacco juice and then gave the signal to the deputy sheriff. "All right, boys, let her rip." A moment later, and the trapdoor fell, and George Barrett dropped out of this world and landed on the other side of eternity. George Barrett was born along a quiet creek in Clay County, and his life was shaped by war, hunger, violence, and a world that never showed him mercy. And George, in return, well, he showed that same mercy to no one. Now, folks will argue whether he was a product of his time or a monster by nature, but the truth is much simpler than that. He was a mountain boy who learned early on that power came from force, and that respect was taken at gunpoint, and survival, well, it meant staying one step ahead of the law. And in the end, the mountains never left him. They only taught him how to roam farther and kill cleaner. And when that trapdoor finally fell, it wasn't justice that claimed George Barrett, but destiny. So there you go, my friends. Now you know the rest of the story about a man that the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, once called the meanest man that Kentucky ever produced. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to your comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia's past.